Hello to everyone trickling in. We might give it a few more seconds just to let everyone connect fully, and then we will begin this webinar to try and start on time. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Natalie. I am one of the Clean Tech Fall interns for this semester, and welcome to UNC's Clean Tech Corner webinar, Transforming Urban Spaces into Livable, Sustainable Communities. We are so excited to have you all here today and want to thank our speakers and moderator for taking the time out of their schedule to contribute to these important discussions.
Thank you so much for your introduction to us all, Natalie. First, we'll have everybody introduce themselves, and then Nate Baker will facilitate the conversation. Please feel free to utilize the Q&A form to ask questions of your own. Laren, would you like to introduce yourself first? Please tell us about your journey to be a leader in sustainability and your current role now. What do you and your organization do?
Sure. So my name is Laren Jensen. I work at Transloc. I'm a corporate communications specialist and the co-host of the Movement podcast. The Movement podcast is a podcast about mobility leadership. So each week we have a different guest who is really bringing about change in their community to make it more sustainable and accessible, and just kind of learning from them, taking some of those lessons and seeing what they're doing to improve their communities. I don't know that I would consider myself a leader in sustainability, but what I am passionate about is equity and race relations. And for me, when I think of creating more livable and sustainable communities, this is inherently an equity issue. So when I came to Transloc, I didn't have the slightest clue what it was. Quickly learned, and I was like, okay, we make transportation software. UNC, as a matter of fact, if any of you guys take the bus at UNC, you guys use our app. I believe you guys are still using the Transloc Writer app. So that'll show you what time the bus is coming, how long the wait is. So for me, though, I said, okay, well, who takes transportation? People who depend on it are typically people who live in poverty, and Black people tend to live in disproportionately higher rates of poverty than their white counterparts. So I was like, okay, this is an easy thing for me to get behind, and that's where I am today.
Next, we could have Sarah introduce herself.
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Sarah Sanford. I work at the East Coast Greenway Alliance. I'm the Virginia and North Carolina coordinator. So for those who don't know, the East Coast Greenway is a 3,000-mile walking and biking route. It goes from Maine to Florida, and our headquarters office is in Durham, right off of the American Tobacco Trail, if folks know that. So I basically oversee all things Greenway for both North Carolina and Virginia. So in terms of my journey in the sustainability field, I started out in kind of a different part of the environmental field. I was an environmental educator and a naturalist. So my job was basically taking people outside, both kids and adults, and getting them connected to nature and learning about the natural world. And then I kind of made my way into the trails and greenways world and realized that that's a whole different part of the sustainability field. And I found that it's a really incredible way to combine both my environmental education work, but also equity work and sustainability work, and just putting it all together to give people an alternative form of transportation that's both sustainable and accessible. So yeah, that's kind of my background, and I'm really happy to be here and excited to hear from the other panelists here as well. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. Next, we'll have Robert introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rob Studiville, and I'm with the Congress for the New Urbanism. And we are a movement that champions walkable urbanism. It began 27 years ago, and among a group of architects and urban designers who saw the problems with sprawl. And about that time, I was also thinking about the problems with our built environment, the sustainability problems, and that it wasn't working well for people. It wasn't working well for all classes of people and all kinds of people. You had to have a car to go everywhere. That was basically the only kind of development that was legal or able to be built at the time. I joined the New Urbanism movement. I founded a publishing company. I later founded a nonprofit planning firm, and we've been working. I've been working in the New Urbanism movement ever since. And so we're the main organization that has members that are urban designers that are focusing on the new urbanism. And so we're working at all scales, from individual buildings up to the region, trying and walkable neighborhoods and everything in between. So that's what we're doing, and we're believing that it results in more sustainable, just, and prosperous places.
Thank you. And then finally, we'll hand it over to Nate Baker for an introduction and a beginning to the program.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm excited to be here. My name is Nate Baker, and I'm an urban planning consultant. I work with a firm called Clarion Associates. We have offices in Chapel Hill and Denver, and we assist local governments with developing long-range, community-driven plans. We do community engagement. We do sustainable zoning and development regulations. So when we think about sort of building the city, we're not engaged in the construction of the city, but we are engaged in shaping the city and thinking about sort of the DNA that constructs the city. And I'm also a member of the Planning Commission here in Durham, North Carolina. So urban areas like Durham, like Chapel Hill, Raleigh, that make up the triangle, urban areas in the United States especially face enormous challenges posed by the current trends, like the urban sprawl that Rob was just talking about, the lack of public transit and the gentrification displacement, our dependence on expensive and fossil fuel burning cars. We know that just 4% of the workers in the Triangle area and in many other cities across the United States are even able to realistically get to work, by biking, by walking, or by taking public transit. And that's a huge problem. The average household in the Triangle area drives about 20,000 miles and spends about $12,000 per year just on transportation, just on trying to get to the places that they need to get to. As a result, our communities are facing pollution. They're releasing emissions that contribute to the climate crisis. Again, for the current growth patterns here in the Triangle, since 1990, our region's greenhouse gas emissions have nearly doubled. And that's actually a growth rate that's higher than our population growth. So long commutes also impact people's physical and their mental health. Auto-related accidents, for example, and auto-related deaths are the #1 cause of death for young Americans. And our auto-related death rates are 3 to 4 times higher than countries of comparable economic scales. People have varying degrees of access to various modes of transportation, as Laren pointed to earlier, and can definitely face inequities in sort of the benefits and the burdens that they experience from our current system of planning in our cities. So we know that there is a need to change, and that reversing course toward a more sustainable and more transit friendly and walkable and green and just future, it can sound overwhelming. And sometimes it can even sound impossible to planners, to young people who want to get involved, to local leaders. and especially when we've had the current systems in place that we have now for many decades. So I want to jump right in and go straight to Laren. You're the co-host of a fantastic and really compelling podcast that explores big questions about planning and equity and transportation. And so I would like to hear from you and then from the other two panelists, what are one or two big changes that you think urban areas need to make to become more sustainable, inclusive, and accessible? And then what do you think the policies are that can actually influence those changes?
Yeah, so I think that you mentioned a couple of them in your opening remarks. The biggest one is expanding the way that we travel. So that means essentially cities being less car friendly. Vehicle emissions are the single greatest contributor to climate change. So that means we need to invest in more and better public transportation, innovative forms of technology. And we need to rethink where we put these things. I think if you look right here in Durham, there are bike paths in certain parts of the city, but they're perhaps not in parts where people who need them the most could benefit for them. They're in more suburban areas and less in the urban areas. So people are forced to drive. I think that public-private partnerships with companies like Spin Scooters, Bird, more of those would help, as well as, I'm sorry, what was the second question?
Well,
I think also,
yeah,
sorry.
I'm just wondering if you think of any policies that can be put into place at any level of government that could sort of benefit some of these challenges.
Right. So one of the other things is the way that we spend our federal dollars in transportation, the majority of it goes to highways instead of public transit. So the more people we can get out of single vehicle occupancy cars or single occupancy vehicle, and the more people we can get onto public transit, that means more people have access to healthcare, jobs, education, and we have less vehicle emissions that is bad for our physical health, our mental health, causes stress. So I think that's the key right there. And I'm not sure how we go about that. I think in many ways, public transit needs a PR makeover. And then also we've got to put other policies in place for politicians in terms of the type of funding or money that they receive from corporate lobbyists. If the majority of their campaign money is coming from big oil and instead of perhaps energy companies, I don't know what a great idea that is either, but we've got to get people behind this idea that public transit is cool, much like it is in Europe. I think those are probably the biggest impediments.
Rob, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things that you can talk about as main problems that are creating some of the difficulties we've been talking about. One is zoning codes and land use regulations in general. If you have problems with the built environment, if it's creating environmental problems, if it's not sustainable, if everybody has to drive everywhere, if it puts strains on household budgets, all these things, it's not an accident. Whatever is out there is actually coded to be built. That's I guess both the bad news and the good news. The bad news is that we've actually created laws to create the built environment the way it is, and the good news is that we can change those laws. Another area that is a problem are streets. I would say both the form of the streets, whether you can walk on them or you can do anything but really drive, whether the streets are friendly for biking and walking. Also, the street networks. Are they in a network that allows for a walkable neighborhood to exist? Generally, so looking at the policies that can be changed for the codes, There's something called form-based codes that you can put into place. Sometimes, they can certainly work. They can work better. They can allow for the creation of a neighborhood. They do take time. They do take money. There's another process which is called incremental code reform, which can be done at any level of government to remove the barriers to creating better places incrementally. And with regard to the streets, we just need to, design walkable streets, design and build more walkable streets and networks.
Great. I'm going to be interested in a couple of things that you all talked about. One of them, Rob's, what you just mentioned about sort of zoning regulations and the standards that we have for our streets. We've known for a long time that we have these issues with our regulations, and yet we continue to see the same kinds of developments. They're sort of steadfast in the way that we're building our cities, and so it seems like we need to have a discussion about how we can actually change those. So we'll get into that, but first I want to have Sarah answer that question.
Yeah, so I think our other two panelists have touched on a lot of this so far, but the main things I'll add is I think the first thing we have to do as urban areas is legitimize alternative forms of transportation. And just the fact that I have to call them alternative forms of transportation is not a good sign. So taking the bus, biking, walking, the subway, the metro, those shouldn't be alternative. They should be normal forms of transportation. And so in urban areas, there are absolutely examples where that's not alternative. You go to New York City, people don't own cars hardly as much as we do down in the South. And the metro is the norm, or the subway is the norm. So I think normalizing it is the first step. And part of the way we do that is through funding. So that touches on the policy question, is not just changing which transportation projects we're funding, but changing our perspective on investment altogether. So Laren already said this, but I'll just repeat. We put so much money into highways, and then we put so much money into repaving highways when a lot of times they don't even need to be repaved. We could take a fraction of that and it could build miles and miles of greenways and bike ped infrastructure. Even just maybe 5% of the funding that's going into highways would do that. So that's a big part of it. And that's a big part of what at the East Coast Greenway Alliance we're working on right now. Is we're working on a project called the Greenway Stimulus. So everyone's heard all about the stimulus, the economic stimulus. So we're working on putting forward this idea of a Greenway Stimulus of, hey, we put forward a stimulus, or Congress put forward a stimulus for transit. Let's do the same thing with greenways and bike ped. We are more reliant on trails and greenways now during COVID than we ever have been before. Gyms are shut down. People need to be outside. They want to be outside. So let's invest in that and give people the infrastructure they need, not just to be outside for recreation, but to commute, to get around, because people are not, they're not getting around the same way they were before. And the pandemic has really pointed that out. So we have to think about how we're investing and really changing our entire perspective on investing in transportation.
Yeah, that's great. That it kind of made me think of that the famous quote, show me your budget and I'll show you your values. And I think that it shows, when it comes to transportation, which is such a durable investment, such a durable form of infrastructure, it doesn't just show our current values, it also shows the values that we've held over the past many decades, right? And so we are living in the world that was built for us, rather than living in the world that we built for ourselves. So we have a few more questions. I'm definitely going to have some follow-up from some of the things that the three of you had to say. But Sarah, I want to point this next question to you. You work in a lot of communities, and so my question is, planning is about people and about communities, and it involves planning, with people, and it also is about achieving better outcomes for people. So my question is, how should we conduct inclusive planning processes for all people who are going to be impacted by particular planning efforts? And how is your organization in particular tackling these issues of equitable engagement?
It's a great question. And I will say, Nate, that you already took some of the words out of my mouth that I was going to say, which is you're talking about planning with people and for people. And that was the first thing I was going to touch on is, again, this perspective changing of we are working with communities and remembering that we are working with people, and we're also working in the communities that we also live in. And so instead of taking this idea of like, well, we are doing this job for them, we get paid to do this for them, that's not really the reality. The reality is we're working with people. And so keeping that perspective of, you know, it's not like we get hired to come in and design something that someone else wants. It's often something that we are invested in too. And keeping in mind that we're working with fellow community members who are our neighbors or sometimes even family. So that's the first step of it. And then I think the second step in terms of equitable engagement that I can speak to for my organization is a big piece of what we're doing is thinking about where our leadership comes from. So quite literally thinking about who's on our advisory board, who is on the board of trustees, and what perspectives are they bringing? And so a lot of that is something that we've taken a second look at and saying, okay, are we really representing these communities in terms of our leadership, and are we getting the right input, and are we getting input from everyone? And so we've really started taking a second look at where we get our advice from, and going to new people and involving new people who, not just in terms of racial diversity, but in terms of diversity of experiences and the urban versus the rural versus the suburban experience, and who can provide those different inputs. So I think that it's, again, so much of it comes back to perspective, what perspective you're taking, but also what perspective you're getting from the people you're working with, and making sure that you're getting all the perspectives and not just the ones that you handpick. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point. Rob, I'm going to be, I'm a new urbanist as well, just like you are. And I also, I'm a new urbanist, I'm a passionate new urbanist, and I think that it represents some of our best hopes for turning things around. But there are often a lot of really legitimate criticisms about the Congress for New Urbanism and sort of the lack of diversity, some of the diversity that Sarah just talked about. And also in terms of some of the communities that are built through the New Urban method. So I'd be interested to hear, your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, well, I mean, the New Urbanism has been working for years to try to address problems of underserved communities, people who don't necessarily have the resources to hire planners. So we've really taken this seriously. Every year we have what are called legacy projects, where we go into underserved communities and do essentially free planning to try to help them to figure out what they think their problems are, and then try come up with a design and policy solutions for that. But I think the New Urbanism has always been working in the full range of the built environment, to try to, what you're referring to may be traditional neighborhood developments, which were created as a alternative to sprawl in the suburbs, but, working in cities, working in small towns, working regionally has always been part of the New Urbanism agenda. You really have to run an inclusive community process. You have to get input from all the people in the community. You have to find the people with connections to people who don't ordinarily come into the charrette process or a design process, and make sure that they are heard. Another helpful thing, it's difficult in COVID, but to plan in the community. You don't plan in an office somewhere far away from the community. You go into the community and you draw in the community. You let people have input while you are drawing, while you are doing the design, to make sure that they like and what you're doing, and it actually meets their vision. So there are many different ways to do this, but having the goal of having an inclusive community process is absolutely central.
Great. What do you think, Laren?
Yeah, I think they both, Rob and Sarah, already they ran the gamut of what needed to be said, but I think it's so important to be talking to the people in the community. And as Rob said, that may not be planning in an office, that may be going to people's houses, that may be going to churches, going to community meetings that aren't like city council meetings. Oftentimes, it's the people who show up at these city council meetings and budget meetings whose voices get heard, and so therefore their needs and their wants are met. But that's also intentional. That is by design, that certain groups are left out of those meetings. So we have to go out of our way to correct course and make sure that those voices that have been disenfranchised, have been intentionally marginalized, are heard, and that their needs are met, because we've built not just those systems, but our entire environment essentially has been built around displacing people, keeping concentrated urban poverty. Wagner-Steagall Housing Act of 1934 saying that, for each new piece of public housing built, that an old dilapidated house needed to be ruined. So laws like that have been put into place to create these areas that are just totally unlivable. And so we have to do our part to correct that. And that means getting in touch with the people, going to them.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think this is such an interesting issue, and it's I think unique to a lot of the challenges and the processes that are faced in the American city. I don't know if you all have read. There's a great book called the Urban Revolution by a French urbanist named Henri Lefebvre, and he really articulated this concept of the right to the city. And it sounds kind of difficult to imagine or to fathom, but the idea is that collectively residents should be able to have some sort of say, or be able to shape the world around them, because that's the world that we live in, the world that you travel around in from day to day, and that as human beings, as people, we should have that right, and that it shouldn't just belong to the powerful, that it shouldn't just belong to whoever is making these donations to politicians, or whoever has the capital to make investments in certain types of development. So I think that's an interesting concept. And one of the other things that I think about a lot is how do we, planning processes rely on resources, because it's really a democratic process, or it should be. And so how are we going to allocate those resources? And so what I oftentimes think about is there are people who are going to show up. They're going to show up and be a part of these planning processes. And there are people who are, even if you want to reach them, they are really challenging to reach. And they have historically not been a part of planning processes. And so I think really what it takes is investing about 90% of your engagement resources on reaching 10% of the population. And that's just kind of the reality of sort of the limited resources that we have in the planning world. Just a few of my thoughts. So I want to ask another question, and then I've got one more, and then we can actually start taking a look at some of the Q&As that are coming in. Rob, this one's for you. So you're deeply involved as a leader in the Congress for New Urbanism in creating much more sustainable communities. What do you think are some of the other benefits from creating sustainable changes that maybe we haven't touched on just yet? For example, how can improved urban spaces and transportation models improve things like physical and mental health, as I touched on at the beginning? And how can we ensure that all people enjoy these benefits and not just those who have the resources?
Hmm. Well, the benefits that you mentioned are, or that you asked about are many. It's when you create a more sustainable place, you also create a healthier place. You create a place where children can play more easily, and where a place where I think is more sociable, and people can have more chance encounters with their neighbors, leading to, I think, like a better functioning community. Like, what are some of the problems with sprawl? It's not just a environmental problem, but you can't walk to school. In 50 years ago, we had more than half of the children walking to school. Now we have something like 15%. That makes a difference in their lives. And I think it does add to, it adds to their physical health, and it adds to, I think it has an impact on people's mental health as well. If people are stuck in their houses, and can't get out and walk around the neighborhood. It has an impact on the financial health of the community as well. As many researchers have shown, that communities that are built in certain ways have more sustainable tax bases, which allows then services to be provided. I think that there are, all these things work together, if you're creating a more livable place.
Cool. How about Sarah? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with everything Rob said. I think when we're thinking about, the benefits from these sustainable changes, there's a lot that we know that's obvious. We know that walking and biking to get around is better for your mental health and your physical health. And I think there's a lot of obvious benefits like that one that have been known for a long time. But then there's the benefits that aren't quite as tangible, that we don't see. And there are studies to back it up, but often we don't read those studies. So just for example, the impact of sitting in a car for an hour every day on your mental health, it's pretty bad for you. And you might not realize it because it can be subtle, but the difference it can make to get to your work, where maybe you're on the bus and just because you're not driving, you have time to, catch up talking to your family or something like that. We don't always see those benefits, but they're there and they're really important. And I think to the part about ensuring that all parties have access to these benefits is important, because right now we're not at a state where everyone has equitable access to these benefits. And what our job is to change the way this infrastructure is built and designed so that everyone can experience this. I think there's often this idea of like, oh, well, biking to work is for, people who work at startups in an office, but what we need to do is make it so anyone who wants to bike to work can bike to work. And if you work at the grocery store, you should be able to bike to work. If you work in, a busy office area, if you work in RTP, you should be able to bike to work. And so there's a lot of change that needs to happen so that everyone can experience these benefits that right now I think only a portion of the population gets to experience.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting idea about the very, very subtle. We know the big impacts. It's easy to calculate a number of collision death rates, for example, but it's really hard to calculate sort of mental health impacts. And I have seen some really interesting studies out there that sort of link the strength of like marriages and commutes. There are creative ways of researching these things so that we can actually have some quantitative data. But I don't think it takes much for people to recognize the enormous impacts on public health. One other thought that I had is, when you're kind of on that big arterial road, the 2, 3, 4 lane road, and you see that person that's just kind of walking along the side and there's no sidewalk, how often do you think, boy, where did they go wrong in their life to be walking on the side of this busy road? It's just kind of it's like an initial reaction. And I always challenge myself to think, how do we fail that person so that they're doing something as natural as using their legs, and we automatically think that they must be doing something wrong. It really, I think, highlights the broken nature of our built environment. So lastly, I'd like to hear your response to that one, Larry.
Yeah, so there are a ton of physical and mental health benefits to more livable spaces. I think just some specifics, we look at things like asthma. I think it's some like 25 million Americans suffer from asthma, but Black and Brown and other minority groups are more likely to suffer from asthma than their white counterparts. I think it's like 13.4% of African Americans versus 7% of white Americans who have asthma. And these things, the prevalence of asthma related like attacks or hospitalizations are increased when you live in more industrialized neighborhoods. So I think Black African Americans are 3 times more likely to die from asthma than other ethnic groups. It's a huge rate. And not just that, minority groups really suffer worse from climate change in general. You're familiar with Denver. So the New York Times recently did an article, published an article titled "Denver's Struggling with its Past with Environmental Racism," or something to that effect. But what it looked at was Denver's neighborhoods, and the whiter neighborhoods, they were full of parks and trees and shrubbery and all of these things. But the Black and Brown neighborhoods, they have paved driveways and yards, and they are on average 5 degrees hotter than citywide temperatures. And you see this all around the nation in neighborhoods that have been historically redlined, which particularly, again, Black and Brown neighborhoods or other minority neighborhoods. So I think if we can change these communities, get rid of some of those cars that just drive through those neighborhoods, even if the people living in those neighborhoods are less likely to own vehicles. If we get rid of some of people's ability to drive through their neighborhoods, there's going to be less smog there. And then put more greenery in, and so we can help elevate. They're not dying from climate change faster than everyone else, but also we all benefit from those things. When we invest in communities that are under-resourced, we by extension benefit from that as well. So.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That discussion about environmental racism, and we think we obviously oftentimes think about sort of the intentional redlining that occurred, and sort of the government policies and programs that were put in place. But I think maybe even if we dug deeper, we would see the inherent racism of some of the markets, some of the capitalist forces that perpetuate these very problematic issues when it comes to racism and classism in the built environment. If only we had more than an hour here. Going to jump into the last question, and then we're going to get into the question answers. There are at least 5 that I'm seeing now, so hopefully we'll be able to get to a couple of them. The last question is more on a positive note here. What are 1 or 2 success stories that you have seen in being able to create some more sustainable and equitable urban areas? I'm going to go ahead and start with Sarah, if you would.
Sure. Yeah. Yay, positive stuff. So one that I'll use, because I do want to keep it as local as possible. An example that we have on the East Coast Greenway in the Triangle is the American Tobacco Trail, which if you live in Durham or Cary or South Durham, you've probably heard of it. It's an old railroad corridor. So it used to be used for transporting on the railways, and it was turned into a trail, a multi-use trail, a really wide one. It's paved, and it goes both through kind of downtown urban Durham, also the suburbs of South Durham, and it goes through a really wide variety of different types of neighborhoods. So if you look at the average income rates or the average home values along the American Tobacco Trail. It's incredibly variable. And what you see is that there's just a really wide variety of people using the trail there, and all for different reasons. A lot of people are out there exercising, but there's also people commuting to work. There's people going and running their errands on the trail. There's people out there just for mental health, just to be outside in nature. And this is, you know, a true multi-use trail, which is really what we're going for. And it's something that is also technically recycled. Again, this was a rail line where it was, people weren't allowed there, and it was fenced off, and it was used just for transporting goods. And I think that's one of the, you know, rail trails, people hear about that a lot, but that's one of the real success stories of how we can relook at our transportation. There's rail lines and abandoned rail lines in every city, and thinking about, well, how can we reuse this to benefit the community the most? And I think the American Tobacco Trail is a really good example of that, because it's not just catering to one part of the population. Everyone's out there. If you go out there at, you know, 6 p.m. on a weekday, you'll see all different types of people, and that's what it's meant to do. So I think that is one of our good success stories here.
That's great. What do you think, Rob?
Oh, there's so many great examples out there. It's hard to really pick one or two, but I'll just name. There's a town called Lancaster, California, out, you know, across the mountains from LA. It's in the desert. It's very, very hot. It's essentially been built since 1950, so it's a very it's mostly a place that's been built with modern planning and modern zoning. It's not very walkable, and there wasn't really many places that actually had a sense of place there. But they had an old Main Street that really was automobile oriented. I had 5 lanes of traffic, went 40 miles an hour, people couldn't cross. And in about 2008, right when the country was going into a huge recession, they redid their Main Street. So that there were only 2 lanes of traffic. There were more trees put on there. They had a different design for parking. It essentially transformed the look of the place. Within 2 years, during the down economy, there was something like $242 million in economic investment that happened, including 800 units of affordable housing. They transformed that community with that one street investment that was about a mile long. You know, I would pick just one other local one, which goes to the trails. We had a park that was very underutilized on our waterfront, and it was very hard to get to. And we did a waterfront trail, and that has like totally transformed our local waterfront, so that people in the city can now get to the water. The park is better utilized. So, you know, yeah. Couple of examples.
Those are great examples. Laren.
Yeah, so on top of the real-time GPS that Transloc makes, we also do what's called on-demand or a demand response. So what we try to do is it really closes that first mile, last mile gap where people live more than a mile away from the nearest bus stop. So essentially it's like, hey, you go into our app and you're like, I want a bus. I need to get somewhere. And then it comes to you, you schedule it. So it helps people who don't have access to cars or vehicles and close bus stops access other things, again, like jobs, education, healthcare, but also they're not having to use other like Uber or Lyft, which again are single occupancy vehicles. So you're ride sharing with more people. And so we've seen this implemented in several places, but one of the places that's been really successful is in Kansas City with KCATA. I believe theirs is called Ride KC, but it took investment outside of KCATA to make this successful. Johnson County had to really step in and say, hey, this is important to our community. KCATA is made up of think like 7 counties, and Johnson County is one of them. And it was so important to them that their residents were able to access transportation to be able to improve their quality of life in other ways, that they really jump-started this initiative and have put a lot of funding into it. And so as a result of it, it's been wildly popular. I think they recently implemented fare-free transportation as well, which I also think is important. If it's free, I think more people want to use it. But so now their community members just have more access to important things that improve their quality of life.
That's awesome. Great stories, guys. My heart is warmer. And now we get to jump into the Q&As here in the next segment, which I am now calling I'll Take That Question. So the way we play this game is I am going to read a question from the audience, and one of my 3 panelists is going to say, I'll take that question. So the first question here is, I wonder what the panelists think about the complications of promoting public transit during COVID-19 when the desire to travel alone is higher than ever.
I'll jump in there. So I think that is the problem, is promoting it. But there are ways around that. Public transportation, one, I think is safer than ever right now. I don't know about safer than ever, but it is way safer than people think. There's all sorts of tools in place that help people. There's contact tracing. So there's cameras on buses that'll show you like how many people have been on the bus, who's been on the bus. You can scan badges. So if someone does happen to come down with COVID-19 and you're using some sort of technology to track what bus you've been on, then you'll get an alert saying that, hey, like, so you may have possibly been exposed to this. So that's one safeguard that's in place. But also there's like passenger counters. So you can get alerts on your phone that let you know how many people are on board. So yeah, the problem is people are scared of it, but they really shouldn't be as scared of it as they are. And again, it's just exponentially better for all of us to use transit than to drive cars everywhere.
Yeah, that's great. Does anybody else want to take that? I'm gonna move on to the next one. Here's a good one. This one is, how can Chapel Hill students, or let's go ahead and say any students or young people, how can students get involved with urban sustainability? Sarah, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I was going to say I can take that question, but I also would probably be good for some of the UNC hosts too to give some tips specific to UNC. But I would say for students in general, trying to, expose yourself to as many different resources and people as possible. So it's rare that as a student, you're going to be like, well, that's the exact job I want, so I'm going to go for that. Most of us don't follow that path and don't know that. So, going to webinars like this, setting up informational interviews with people in the field, which we are happy to do, is a big part of it. And also getting involved with the local planning process is huge. Anyone is allowed to attend, well, most city council meeting, most planning commission meetings, they're open for the public. And so part of that is just going and watching the process, seeing how it's done. And then eventually you get to the point where maybe you want to be involved and serve as a volunteer or work on the planning process yourself. I think that's a huge part of it is trying it out, because you might find, okay, this is the part I find interesting and I don't really like that part as much. And so until you try, you don't really know. And you can take classes, which are wonderful, but I think the real world experience is even more important of getting your hand involved in it. And like I said, I think a big part of it too, as you're going down your path towards looking for a job, is who you know and making those connections. I wish that it wasn't that way and it would make life easier, but introducing yourself to people and just asking questions. That's part of what we're here for, is to answer your questions and help you on that path. So feel free to reach out to me, and I think the other panelists probably feel the same way. And yeah, ask lots of questions.
I agree that keeping your eyes open, read some of the great planning texts. Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities. I would, if you haven't read that one, you really should read it, because it will open your eyes up to how cities work. And Jane Jacobs was all about, looking at, observing with her own eyes. And that's ultimately how you find out how cities work, as you observe yourself, how it works, the places you like, what makes them work, what makes them not work, what are the dimensions? I mean, don't just take it in as a whole, but like each particular part, how big is it? How small is it? How far are they apart? Those sorts of questions will help you to understand cities better. And hopefully that'll take you on a lifelong journey of learning about cities.
So the next question is has a little bit of planning jargon, but I think it introduces a really interesting concept. The next question is, how can local municipalities work around quasi-Dillon's rule in pushing for more sustainable policies? And what that means is essentially in the United States, most states are sort of broken between what's called a Dillon's rule state and a home rule state. And that sort of, it's sort of a legal framework for how how legislatures can enable planning legislation or not, or disenable legislation. So in the state of North Carolina, for example, we're a quasi-Dillon's rule state, which means that, for example, if we want to use a particular type of tool, for example, if we want to require that in new developments, 15% of the units in that new development are affordable, then we would have an inclusionary zoning ordinance. That is not necessarily enabled in the state of North Carolina. And so what happens across the United States is that there are a lot of tools that are not available in some local jurisdictions that are available in other local jurisdictions. And so I bring that up because I think that it's important for us to always remember that we're working in a challenging context here in the state of North Carolina and in other states. And that sometimes we need to be thinking about politics, not just at the local level, but at the state level as well. So the last question here from the question and answer is it feasible to fund mainly walking, biking paths when more and more people are living farther away from where they work? And would funding electric bus fleets or electric trains have greater impact, especially for low income citizens? So let's go ahead and each of us can answer this, and then I think that'll kind of take us out. So Laren, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. So it's probably not feasible. I think we're actually seeing the opposite. There's more of a trend going back to urban areas and not the reverse. So that helps, one. But two, I think COVID will also help with that. We're seeing more and more remote work, and I don't think that all of these jobs are going to go back into the office. But electric buses and electric fleets are super important, so we should be funding those. We need to really, as Sarah said, diversify and be using alternative methods of transportation. So the goal isn't to get all of the cars off the road. Maybe it is, but to have multiple modes of transportation that people can have access to and use, if that's the case. So we do want more bikeways and pathways, because that's just good for people in general. It's good to have more greenery. It's better for climate change, and it's good for people to get outside and breathe fresh air, and it's good for our hearts. But the more alternative forms of transportation we can have, the better. So, yeah.
Sarah?
Yeah, I love this question because it brings up something that we often say with the Greenway, is that the Greenway is not the solution, it is one of the solutions. So the solution is not to have everyone just walking and biking everywhere all the time. For example, if you live in Durham but you work in Raleigh, trust me, you are not going to bike back and forth to Raleigh every day, unless you're an extreme athlete. But it's having the combination of options, multimodality. So It's being able to walk to the bus stop and then take the bus to your work and then back, and then you walk that additional, whatever it is, half mile home. People are very rarely taking only one mode of transportation. We need all types. So no, we shouldn't fund mainly biking, walking paths. We should fund greenways and transit and all different types of transit. So really, it's absolutely a combination.
Yeah, that's a great response. I also think it's because I work in the realm of land use a little bit more than in transportation. And so I think that these are both topics that complement one another. And often when I'm thinking about sort of walkability, transit-friendly development, I'm thinking about not just how do you get from point A right here to point B all the way over there, but how do we make sure that point B is closer to where you need to go? How do we make sure that you are able to live in a home or a house that is in the location where you want to be? And we know that more and more people want to be able to walk places and are simply not able to. So how can we actually change that and change our land uses and the development so that people can be a little bit closer? So Rob, what do you think?
I mean, well, I mean, it gets back to changing our planning, changing our streets, creating a walkable streets and a network of walkable streets, so that people, can walk and bike on their streets. Trails serve a really important purpose, but it shouldn't be the primary mode for how people get around is on a walking or biking trail. That means that your built environment is really impoverished because there is no way to get around on the streets other than taking a car. So it is, yeah, as Sarah said, it's definitely a combination of that. But you need to create the walkable streets and change the zoning codes to allow for better communities to be built.
That's awesome. Okay, I said that was the last question, but I've got one more question for everyone. I want to hear, what do you think is the American city that best resembles a sustainable city? We'll start with you, Rob, and then Sarah, and then Laren.
Well, it's kind of hard to answer that question, but I will, I'll be parochial and I'll just say Ithaca, the place that I live, is a great example of a sustainable.
It's a very walkable town.
It's got more than 40% of the people walk to work. It's a place that is walkable. It's bikeable if you can go up the hills. So you have to be in good shape to go up and down those hills. But it's a place that's also a good size. It's surrounded by nature. It's surrounded by countryside, so that we have farm fields that feed that supply the city, and that's all part of sustainability. So there's a good balance between nature and an urban place in Ithaca.
What do you think, Sarah?
This is such a tough question. And also because I work with so many different communities, I can't say one of the communities I work with because then the other ones are not going to be happy with me. And it's also funny because when you first said that, I had a bunch of cities that immediately came to mind. And then I was like, oh, he said American. Like there's so many cities in the Netherlands, in Germany, and places like that who, unfortunately, fortunately for them, but they're doing a lot better job than we are. I would say, I think the Pacific Northwest in general is on the cutting edge with a lot of this in the US in terms of their transit and their bike ped infrastructure. I haven't spent enough time out there to really single out one city, but I do think they have, going back to what I said earlier about normalizing different forms of transportation, that you don't get that same reaction of like, oh, you bike to work? That's so weird. It's just so many people do it. So many people take the bus that it's kind of the norm out there. And in terms of environmental regulations, they tend to be a little more progressive as well. So I think general Pacific Northwest, they're on to something.
Yeah, so it's definitely not where I grew up, which is the greater LA area. It's probably like the worst place. Um, and I'm not sure which place is the best, but I can name a couple of places that I think are on their way. And one of them is like Sarah said, Seattle. So they've recently opened up lots of cities around the country, but Seattle in particular has opened up 20 miles of streets, open streets. So for people to walk, bike, whatever, through the streets instead of driving cars. They've closed them off completely to cars so people can walk and bike on them. And that also, it stimulates the local economy. Restaurants, you can sit outside, just breathing fresh air, getting in some good exercise. But also Minneapolis is doing some good things in terms of innovative transit. So I think those two.
Yeah, it's such a hard question in the United States, right? Because we sort of have our northeastern cities, which benefit from history and sort of having developed pre-car, pre-World War II. And then we have the Pacific Northwest, which has shown itself to be sort of a leader in planning recently. And also, as you mentioned earlier, Laren, what is sustainability? I think we oftentimes go straight to the environmental sustainability and sort of walkability, protection of green space, but there's also the equity issue. And while I think that the Pacific Northwest is also a leader in sort of focusing on equity, I think that there are some local examples that might be doing pretty well too. I would actually be interested in taking a closer look at a place, Wilson, North Carolina, which is a small city in eastern North Carolina. And they made some really smart investments, some really smart decisions early on. They have, they have public internet that they also provide for free to local areas around them. And they have, some pretty innovative planning going on. And so, I think that there's some good examples. There's some good planning that's happening in this area as well. So I just want to say that this has been really fun. Rob, Laren, and Sarah, thank you three so much for being a part of this with me. 10 out of 10, I would do it again. Natalie and Jessica and everyone else from the Clean Tech program, thank you for inviting us. And I'm going to go ahead and hand things back over to the hosts.
Yeah, thank you, Nate. On behalf of the Clean Tech Corner at UNC, again, we'd really like to thank all of our panelists and Nate for moderating. And then to our participants, thank you for attending this webinar. This was recorded and will be available on demand for your viewing accessibility and open to the public. And finally, we just really appreciate all of the people here taking the time out of your day to be a part of these important discussions surrounding the future of our sustainable communities. And that is the end of the webinar. So again, thank you for showing up and thank you to all of the people who made this possible.
Thank you all for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Fun.